I'm Russ Jaffe, physician and biochemist, certified clinical nutritionist, a fellow of the National Academy for Clinical Biochemistry, an overseas fellow of the Royal Society of Medicine, and I maintain fellow status in the American Society for Clinical Pathology, the American College of Nutrition, the scientific aspect of the American College of Allergy, Asthma, and Immunology, and in the American Medical Laboratory Immunologists. I'm a fellow of the Health Studies Collegium and founder and director of both PERQUE and ELISA Act Biotechnologies. So welcome. And in our rethinking of health and well-being from the perspective of physiology first, we found clinically the alkaline way. It has extensive historical as well as evidence base, and we're looking tonight at one particular aspect of the application of the alkaline way clinically through the lens of physiology first. In previous webinars, we've looked at first morning urine pH and specific gravity. We've looked at stool in terms of digestive transit time and digestive analysis. And in this part 3, we'll be looking at hydration and stress hormones, particularly DHEA and cortisol. And in the next part, part 4, we'll look at physical evidence of vitamin needs and evidence-based confirmatory tests. Well, hydration, or how much fluid and moisture you have, is really quite important. And a typical person will have 2.5 liters or 2,500 milliliters per day loss of water. Of this, typically, 1.5 liters or 1,500 milliliters per day comes from the kidneys through the urine. The skin is responsible for about 500 mils per day based on evaporation and perspiration. For lungs, it's 300 mils a day respired out in the out breath, and in the GI tract through the stool, typically 200 milliliters per day. Now, these are quite variable numbers. The GI tract, lungs, and skin in particular can give off more or less, and the kidneys are responsible for compensating and concentrating the urine. So we must take in about 2.5 liters a day, that's close to 2.5 quarts, just to deal with daily sensible and insensible loss. The sensible loss is what we see coming out of the kidneys. The insensible loss is what leaves the body through the skin, evaporation and perspiration, through the lungs, respiration, and through the GI tract in the form of stool. Yet our body is 70+% water. And human fluids do contain vital health messages. When we look correctly and analyze the urine, stool, saliva, and blood, we can get much useful information. And what it comes down to is in the lower left of this slide, that we are and become the products of what we eat and drink, think, and do. What we eat and drink is important. What we think and do is important. We are and become the product of what we eat and drink, what we think and do. And the good news, the even better news, is that we have choices. We can cultivate habits in eating, drinking, thinking, and doing that build our reserves and resilience, that enhance our hydration and other health variables, and that make good use of the opportunities to think deeply about the choices we make in eating, drinking, thinking, and doing as keys to our well-being. Now, what about dehydration? Dehydration is associated with a decreased flow of saliva, a decreased blood volume, an increased osmotic pressure, which means more particles in more concentrated blood. So dehydration leads to thirst in healthy people. But many adults today have a distorted taste sensation. They have a distorted tongue and brain connection because of the restructured foods, the high fat, high sugar, high protein foods, the fiber poor, nutrient poor foods that many people take in. And so many people have lost this healthy thirst that to healthy people indicates they need to take a glass or two of water. Now, how do we know our hydration status? And there is a palm skin pinch test that I'd like to briefly describe. It is a simple dehydration test. And as you can see from the picture, you hold your hand with the fingers straight out in front of you, and with the other or contralateral hand, you gently tent or pinch about ½ an inch, about a centimeter of the skin pulled back of the palm. This pinched skin is then released. And if it goes flat before you can say 1/1000, you're well hydrated. Mild dehydration begins at any more than 1 second time for the skin to go flat. And if the skin maintains this tent for longer, if it takes 5 to 10 seconds to go flat, that's moderate dehydration. Now, dehydration begins at 1 to 3% loss. Moderate dehydration begins at 3% loss. And at moderate dehydration, or 3% loss of blood volume and water content of the body, just a 3% reduction in the overall body water content puts an extra stress on the spleen, on the heart, on the blood vessels. So moderate dehydration, which is associated with a slow relaxation, 5 to 10 seconds time, is further advanced than I would want anyone to be. I think we should all be looking at the milder forms of dehydration, where it takes more than 1 second for the skin to go flat, and that's what we are looking for, is the skin going flat so quickly that you can't even count 1 second in that time. If you find your or your client's skin does take longer than a second to go flat, we recommend taking a glass or two of water, preferably mineral rich, and rechecking in as soon as a ½ an hour or an hour, because water comes into the body and is redistributed quickly. And so when you have enough hydration, that reflects in a healthy wrist skin pinch test, where the skin goes flat before you can say 1/1000. Now, the next point I'd like to make is about electrochemically or machine-made alkaline water. And there are machines today that can give you alkaline water. They do this by electrically splitting the water to remove one side, the protons or the acids, and to leave the other side, or the OH minus or the hydroxyl, which you see in orange in the middle right of the slide. However, electrochemically or machine-made alkaline water does not alkalinize the body. It is too caustic. It tries to fool the body, but fooling nature, we find, doesn't work well. And so we recommend that you take mineral-rich water, not electrically produced alkaline water, that mineral-rich waters will be alkaline and healthier, that fooling the body really is not a wise choice. And so chemically or electrically or machine-made alkaline waters are fine for laboratories, but not helpful for people. Now, what are the qualities that we want? We want water that is fully mineralized. We want water that has more than 1 gram of dissolved solids per liter. We want water that is as healthy as possible. And if you're using well water, or what might be called aquifer water, we would want you in the 3rd aquifer. That's down below where the ground seepage occurs, and generally high quality. That water is 53 degrees. It will come out of the tap cold enough that the plumber will be able to tell you that it's from the 3rd aquifer. And this is the water being fully mineralized that has the best microclustering, or the best relationship between minerals and the water molecules. So we want hard or fully mineralized waters, such as the classic alkaline waters that have over the years been popular. And we can get this often from our locale by tapping down into the 3rd aquifer with a well, and then having that water tested. We recommend twice a year to make sure that its composition, both of minerals and of contaminants, remains high in minerals and absent of contaminants. Now let's look together at sources of biological acid. There are 4 sources of biological acid. These include oxidative stress, immune reactions, water, and food. And we're going to look at each of these. So let's start with the first bullet, the upper left, sources of biological acid, oxidative stress. It turns out that xenotoxins, the environmental hormone disruptors, the environmental toxins, these man-made, recently introduced into the environment toxins, are almost all and uniformly free radical generators, that is, oxidized or oxidative stressors. They oxidize the beneficial and protective antioxidants. They oxidize and damage these protective antioxidants. And so oxidative stress is increased by environmental toxins, xenotoxins, metabolic wastes, and just distress. When we see the world as more stressful rather than more opportune, when our internal orientation is towards distress rather than what Hans Selye called eustress, the harmful rather than beneficial side of stress as we perceive it. And it does turn out that the internal adaptation, which we can influence, is much more important than the external stress. It's how we perceive stress that's most important, and that determines whether it's distress or eustress, harmful or helpful stress. So in oxidative stress, we would look at the cortisol to DHEA ratio, preferably the free cortisol to free DHEA. We can look at this in the saliva or in the plasma. And we might also want to look at the adrenaline or epinephrine to serotonin or 5-HT relationship. We'll talk more about these stress hormones and stress neurochemicals. The headline here is that we want a healthy balance of cortisol and DHEA, a healthy balance of adrenaline and serotonin, and that these can be impaired by oxidative stress if it's sufficient. The second source of biological acid are immune reactions. When the innate immune system, that includes blood clotting and kinins and cytokines and prostaglandin communication molecules, the innate or intrinsic immune system, the immune system that is managed by the dendritic or first responder cells, the granulocytic cells, the cells that engulf something foreign, put it in a lysosome or a granule inside the cell, break down the thing that is foreign to its building blocks, and then use those building blocks to build the cell back up. The innate immune system contributes a modest amount of metabolic or biological acid. The acquired or the adaptive or the backup immune system, the complement, the reactive antibodies, the T cell responses, those acquired immune reactions that we're so familiar with, but that indicate a loss of first-line response competence, that indicate potential loss of immune tolerance. These produce much more biological waste acid. Complement itself produces acidic end products. Antibody reactions and T cell responses are metabolically and biologically active, and they produce more than ample biological acids. The third potential source of biological acid is the water that we drink. Most tap water today is acidic, and more acidic than it was 20 or 50 or 100 years ago. That means mineral depleted and acid enriched. What we would want for our water is that we have dissolved solids of more than 1 gram. This makes the water hard by definition. Hard water is mineral rich. The dissolved solids are minerals and they're mineral salts. And we would want more than 1 gram or more than 1,000 milligrams per liter to replenish the minerals that our body loses because of metabolic acids. Now, the fourth source of biological acid is food. The net metabolism of most foods yields acid, and there are alkaline-forming foods, and they yield buffer or minerals from their net metabolism. So some foods are acid-forming, and some foods are alkaline or buffer-rich. And we would recommend choosing a diet that is richer in alkaline-forming foods, drinking water that is mineral-rich, and also identifying and avoiding immunoreactive substances and sources of oxidative stress. So in reverse order, we would want to look at the food and water choices. We would want to look at the exposures to immune reactions and oxidative stress in order to identify sources of biological acid so that these can be mitigated or minimized in each of us or in the people. So here we find that the body is indeed 70% water, that there are hormone rhythms that relate to the status of hydration. These are vital health messages that relate to our being the product of what we eat and drink, think, and do. And we can measure here the stress hormones. It's the active free hormone that we're interested in, the free cortisol and free DHEA. Not the total cortisol or the DHEA-S or the DHEA sulfate, but the free cortisol and free DHEA, the active free cortisol and active free DHEA. That's what we'd want to measure. We'd want to measure that at 4 different time points, such as on rising, 7 a.m., about 11 a.m., 4 p.m., and 10 p.m. before bed. This helps us with the daily rhythm of cortisol and its relationship to DHEA. And since the saliva is an ultrafiltrate of plasma, saliva is a plasma ultrafiltrate. So in the plasma, we would have the free cortisol and the bound cortisol, and we could separate them. But in the saliva, we would have only the free cortisol, because only the free cortisol comes across in that ultrafiltration process, and the bound cortisol does not. So saliva or plasma are media that we can use to measure free and active cortisol and DHEA hormones, and we want to do that at 4 different time points so we can look at the rhythm. If you look in the upper right part of this slide, you'll see that on the left we have a normal hypothalamus that releases releasing factors, CRH and AVP, dripping down the pituitary stalk. These interact with the delicate pituitary gland. It puts out ACTH, adrenocorticotrophic hormone. This goes to the adrenal gland. The adrenal gland then makes androgens, anabolic hormones, DOAC, which is desoxycortisol, and various other products, and produces the cortisol from that adrenal gland. Now, the products of the gland come back to the pituitary and hypothalamus and give a feedback inhibition when the body has enough of those hormones. And you see on the right what happens when there's glucocorticoid resistance or sugar insulin intolerance. When there's glucocorticoid resistance, the same initial process from the hypothalamus through its releasing hormones or factors to the pituitary gland, and from the pituitary gland to the adrenal gland itself, that then releases androgens, but these feedback molecules from androgens to desoxycorticosteroids to cortisol itself go back to the pituitary or the hypothalamus, and they find the receptors not as available, which means the body has to produce more of these hormones like cortisol in order to modulate or turn down the brain stimulation response. And you can see in this visual that the adrenal gland of a healthy person is smaller than the enlarged or hypertrophied adrenal gland of someone who's in the early stages of glucocorticoid or sugar hormone resistance, insulin resistance. On this next slide, we reinforce that the body is 70% water, and we want to look at these hormone rhythms, these vital health messages. On the left, you see a typical laboratory nomogram. It allows you to measure on the left axis the cortisol and to array that at different times during the day. You can also look at the cortisol DHEA correlation, and the lab will say this person is within the usual rhythm, below or above the usual rhythm, or out of range at a time during the day, but not at other times. On the right side, we look from normal through glandular failure at the stages of adrenal exhaustion. And what you see is that in healthy people, there's a healthy relationship between cortisol, that's the dotted top line, pregnenolone, that's the solid line, and DHEA, which is the dashed line. As we lose resilience, we also lose the healthy relationships between cortisol, pregnenolone, and DHEA. In stage 1, the cortisol is continuing to go up, but the DHEA can't keep up and begins to go down. So the distress hormone cortisol goes up. The DHEA, however, does not follow and goes down. So the anabolic hormones that come from DHEA are reduced, but the distress, the cortisol, the hormone that's like cortisone, is increased. This is increased autocoids, increased cortisol produced by the body in disproportion or not in proportion to the DHEA. In stage 2, the cortisol is beginning to come down and the DHEA goes down further. In stage 3, which is just before adrenal failure, we find low cortisol, lower pregnenolone, and low DHEA, not because the person doesn't need more hormones, but because they've been overstimulated to the point where they have now become exhausted. And more adrenal stimulation at this point will push the person further down. We have developed a tropho-restorative or uniquely adaptogenic adrenal formula that we'll talk about in a few minutes to restore each of these different stages and phases of adrenal stress and exhaustion. We can take a moment to look at adrenal hormones. This is about stress hormone balance. Cortisol is the molecule that says flight, fight, or fortitude. Now, most of you have probably heard about flight or fight, that we have the choice of running away or getting into a fight. We have rethought these choices and looked at the research data, and we found that there is a third choice. You can flight, you can flee, you can fight, or you can show resilient fortitude in the face of stress. And so there are some people who can balance their internal adaptation and be resilient even in the face of external stress. So cortisol is a powerful defense agent. It alerts us. It slows down digestion. It says, don't do anything elective like digest your food. We might be under attack or assault, so let's get ready. It holds immune reactions at bay. It suppresses immune reactions, but it keeps us on edge. And so cortisol for a moment is our friend, but cortisol regularly or throughout our days and lives is harmful. DHEA, on the other hand, can be thought of as the mother hormone. It's the feel-good anabolic hormone. It promotes immune system health and youthful vitality. And here we have two terms coined by Hans Selye. One is eustress, the other is distress. In eustress, we have an external challenge, we have an external stress, and we have both DHEA and cortisol going up together. In some cases, DHEA even more than cortisol, but they stay in ratio or in relationship. In contrast, the harmful side of stress, the distress, what we usually think of as stress is the harmful distress side. That's where the cortisol is going up and the DHEA is coming down until eventually both fall in later stages of adrenal exhaustion. So in the early and typical clinical stages, we find people who are better adapted, those who keep their relationship between DHEA and cortisol. Those are the eustress people. And then the distress people are those that have an increase in cortisol and a decrease in DHEA until both finally fall, indicating adrenal fatigue or hypoadrenalism. If you look in the upper right of this slide, you'll see the kidney and the fatty tissue that sits on top of it. The fatty pad is called the adrenal gland, and it has two parts, an outer cortex and an inner medulla. Medulla for middle or inside, and cortex for outside or covering. And the cortex, or the outside of the adrenal, is where we make glucocorticoids like cortisol, mineralocorticoids like aldosterone, and sex hormones, sex steroids like testosterone and other anabolic hormones. From the middle or the medulla of the adrenal, we get the neurochemicals or neurotransmitters, such as epinephrine adrenaline or norepinephrine noradrenaline, and these are produced in the interior or medulla of the adrenal gland. Let's look here at a comprehensive protection plan for hormone balance, taking into account the fact that glucocorticoid resistance and insulin resistance are all too prevalent and common today. And we have pioneered a unique combination of rhodiola, high in rosivins, balanced with magnolia and philodendron supercritical extracts, in perilla oil and MCT, or medium chain triglycerides, the alkalinizing beneficial oils. With phosphatidylcholine, turmeric, we have combined these into a uniquely adaptogenic and tropho-restorative rehabilitation and repair formulation for adrenal restoration. And the comprehensive protection of adrenal hormone balance that we offer is PERQUE Adreno Distress Guard. This is a formula that's tropho-restorative. This is a formula that supports but doesn't force the adrenal glands. It deals with the costs of high-tech living so that we can repair the HPA, or hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. It helps us restore sleep rhythms, and one of the signs of adrenal distress is a loss of restorative sleep. People who get up about every sleep cycle, whether they need to go to the bathroom or not. This helps rebuild immune defense and repair, since the neuroimmunohormonal system are really one integrated control system in the body. And so the takeaway is that cortisol to DHEA rhythm improves, making healthier homeostasis, or healthy feedback, healthier life balance. So if we want to restore adrenal function, we'd want to do that carefully. We'd want to do that respectfully. We'd want to do that in a tropho-restorative, adaptogenic formula. That whether your hormones are too high or too low, whether you are under usual kinds of stress and wanting better rhythm from your hormones, you find that the product delivers on this promise for the different populations. Now here's a summary, and I would refer you to other presentations for more detail, but here's a summary of what we found in a research study of people who consumed PERQUE Adreno Distress Guard for just 6 weeks. And we found successful improvement in cortisol rhythms after just 6 weeks on this unique adrenal support formula. And what we see here is the mean and standard deviation of cortisol values at 4 different times. And we show the before, this is the diamonds pre, and the after, the post squares. We see this at on rising or 7 a.m., late morning 11 a.m., afternoon 5 p.m., before bed 10 p.m. And what we see for the group is that at each time point, they were at the lower end of acceptable for usual ranges, and after just 6 weeks on PERQUE Adrenal Distress Guard, they moved up higher in the morning when the cortisol should be at its peak, coming down nicely in the afternoon, and beginning to come back up in the evening. So we also see considerable individual variation. These are the standard deviation error bars that you see. And if we looked in more detail, we would see that people who started out too low came up, people who started up too high came down, and the people who were within the usual range improved their rhythm, improved their hormonal resilience. So all the different groups at all the different phases of adrenal response responded favorably to PERQUE Adreno Distress Guard. This is a unique response in terms of scientific studies based on the tropho-restorative or adaptogenic quality of the PERQUE Adreno Distress Guard formula. So the takeaway is successful outcome results with better cortisol and DHEA levels as well as rhythm after just 6 weeks on the product. Not 6 months or 2 years, just 6 weeks. Looking at the saliva for free hormone, or we could have looked in the plasma, but in this study we looked in the saliva at different time points, all 4. And the pre and post evaluations confirmed success with p-values of less than 0.005 and analyses of variance with a p-value of less than 0.001. So statistically significant improvements in just 6 weeks in a community-based controlled study. People were asked to consume the Adrenal Distress Guard for that 6 weeks, report how they were doing, and we measured them at the start as well as at the end. Here I'd like to show you individual responses. This is a case with high morning cortisol, and what we see is successful improvement in cortisol rhythms after just a 6-week implementation. So before the cortisol was high in the morning, it crashed by 11 a.m., it came up in the afternoon, and it crashed again at night. And what we see after 6 weeks is that the morning cortisol has come up a bit, but it's able to sustain itself so that the 11 a.m. hasn't fallen out, and the afternoon doesn't have a hyper response, but rather a healthier rhythm curve. So here's an example that starts high in the morning, crashes by late morning, comes up in the afternoon, and crashes again before bed. And what we found after just 6 weeks was a higher, healthier morning start, better rhythm, and over time we would expect that morning to come down a bit as the body readapts to feedback from the adrenal glands to the pituitary and hypothalamus. Let's look at another case. Here is a case where the pre-value was quite high. The cortisol value came down dramatically by 11 a.m. and stayed down in the afternoon and evening. And after just 6 weeks in this individual, we find that the cortisol has come down in the morning. However, it doesn't dramatically fall. It actually stays reasonably okay for 11 a.m. through 5 p.m. and through the evening. And this is this is in process. This is not a fully healed result, but this is a healing outcome to give you some examples of unusual cases that you may see in practice. Now, adrenal fatigue and insulin resistance coexist, and you may be familiar with how common today insulin resistance or hormone resistance is in the body. We looked at this question in the course of our studies because we know that adrenal fatigue and metabolic syndrome or insulin resistance are linked. We know that insulin resistance, which is subnormal biological response to any given insulin concentration, that insulin resistance is associated with, if you look in the upper left, weight gain and obesity. Insulin resistance, if you look straight up, is associated with increased circulating free fatty acids, triglycerides, and so forth. If you look in the upper right, there's a green oval that looks at lipoatrophy and adipokine abnormalities. This means fat cells that don't want to give up their fat. Insulin resistance in the lower right may have some genetic components, may be related to age and physical inactivity, and in particular, the lower left, which is physical inactivity or being sedentary. The most recent study that I saw when controlling for all other variables, finds that for every hour over 4 that you're seated or sedentary during the day, your risk of all causes of morbidity and mortality go up 11% per hour. So at 6 hours, your risk is 22% higher than people who are more active. At 4 hours, your risk is 44% higher than people who are more active. So physical inactivity in itself is a major predisposing variable to insulin resistance, and its consequences: obesity, weight gain, circulating triglyceride and free fatty acid increase, and then abnormalities in fat pad metabolism, the adipokine lipoatrophy issues. Now, adrenal fatigue and metabolic syndrome or insulin resistance are related. These are related to the levels of cortisol and insulin. When cortisol levels go down, it slows energy production. When insulin levels come up, it increases glucose demand. And improved adrenal function, just taking this tropho-restorative adaptogenic PERQUE Adreno Distress Guard, decreases insulin resistance and helps restore healthy rhythms, feedback, and homeostasis, or life vitality. Now, is there any evidence that PERQUE Adreno Distress Guard improves sugar insulin function? Here we have one of the participants in the study, DG. We're looking at better insulin function after just 6 weeks. If we look at the HOMA, which is the homeostatic model assessment, the preferred way of looking at glucose and insulin relationships, there's a 28% improvement in the HOMA, 28% improvement in the homeostatic model assessment, and a 38% improvement in the glucose-insulin ratio. Now, in regard to HOMA, higher is better. In regard to glucose-insulin ratio, higher is better. In regard to HOMA, lower is better. And in this bar graph, you see the glucose-insulin ratio on the left in purple. You see an increase from 3.89 to 6.25. That's substantial improvement in insulin function or decrease in insulin resistance. And in regard to the HOMA, it went from 5.72 down to 4.1 in just 6 weeks on PERQUE Adreno Distress Guard. If we look at another example from that study, ED showed better insulin function after just 6 weeks. There was a 38% improvement in the HOMA and a 34% improvement in the glucose-insulin ratio. We remember that glucose-insulin ratios get better when they go up. So on the left, we see the purple going from 4.25 to 6.49. And on the right, the HOMA, where lower is better, we see an improvement from 6.39 to 3.95. So whether we look at the homeostatic model assessment, as you see on the right, or the glucose-insulin ratio, as you see on the left, you have a confirmation of improved insulin responsiveness, insulin sensitivity, after just 6 weeks on PERQUE Adreno Distress Guard. Now, hormones are fundamental to health. Antioxidants are small dietary molecules that largely determine treatment success by protecting hormones. Would like to make 4 points here. The first is that inflammation, that common tie from almost all chronic diseases, cardiovascular diseases are associated with inflammation. Cancer's now been linked to inflammatory responses. Autoimmune diseases, chronic and degenerative diseases, pain syndromes are all associated with inflammation, which is in itself a swelling, but it is also, when we rethink it from a physiologic perspective, a repair deficit. So inflammation equals repair deficit. Inflammation really is cumulative repair deficit, and we can rethink inflammation as repair deficit and see many opportunities to improve outcomes. We want, however, to look at a preventive or proactive approach. We want to remember that adrenal distress has different phases, and people will have different responses depending on where they are in those phases to a similar kind of stress pattern. And lastly, fat or lipid management, we want to be proactive so that we have healthy adrenal glands sending out messages to balance out both the stress hormones and also the sugar and insulin relationships. We clinically recommend the Alkaline Way. It has many benefits, not the least of which are beautiful foods. The Alkaline Way is proactive about repair. It therefore is antioxidant, anti-inflammatory, and stops oxidative stress. And the Alkaline Way benefits are many in the form of easier digestion, assimilation, and elimination, improvement in stress, hormone, neurochemical, and immune function, and multiple other collateral benefits of what we call clinically the Alkaline Way to sustainable well-being. We want to rethink antioxidant recycling networks. Ascorbate is the key to clinical success, and particularly when people take the amounts of ascorbate they need based on individual calibration or the C-flush protocol. We also want to rethink the antioxidant recycling network because antioxidants prevent oxidative damage, and when we see signs of oxidative damage, we're really seeing the depletion of needed antioxidants. The Alkaline Way is also an approach to safer detoxification and enhanced repair, and we're in favor of safer detoxification as well as enhanced repair from daily wear and tear. The antioxidant recycling network encourages us to rethink body needs based on individual calibration, especially of calibration of ascorbate intake, and since the protective antioxidant ascorbate enhances glutathione better than anything else, including taking glutathione directly, we want to have enough ascorbate to protect all of the antioxidant network, starting with the tocopherols and selenomethionine in the membrane, continuing through ascorbate and glutathione in the cytoplasm to FAD and NAD as they shuttle these electrons into the mitochondria battery so that the body can extract ATP energy from those high energy electrons. When you don't have the antioxidant network shuttle working, then the electrons get free where they shouldn't be. They become oxidizing challenges or free radicals. And we would recommend not having free radicals inside our body, but rather having a healthy flow of electrons. We'd also like to review the first morning urine pH and the importance of looking at the urine as an indicator of body acid status. And as you see on the top, below 6.5 is excess acid, and that wears you out. Above 7.5 consistently is catabolic illness that tears you down. But in the middle, 6.5 to 7.5, we have the healthy repair and restoration zone, and that's where we recommend you stay, and that you increase the alkaline-forming foods, the mineral-rich and the short, medium-chain fatty acid-rich foods that alkalinize us if your first morning urine pH is less than 6.5, and if it's above 7.5 regularly, we'd recommend reversing the catabolic or autocannibalistic side, usually due to surgery or burns or some other significant stress that causes the body to shift into a cannibalistic mode where lean muscle is lost at a time when we actually want to build lean muscle, and the Alkaline Way is helpful in this regard. On the bottom you see the pH Hydrion Microfine 5.5 to 8.0 range paper we recommend. This is high color contrast, so you can see subtle differences between 5 and up to 8 in small increments. You either pee directly on the strip of paper or pee into a cup and dip the strip into the urine. Compare the color change with what you see on that guide. And we recommend recording in a log your first morning urine daily pH as well as how you're doing. And most people, and this is quite consistent, they find the days when they're in the healthy zone, they're less symptomatic, more optimistic and resilient. The days that they are more acidic, those are the days when they're less hopeful, they're more hopeless, they're more symptomatic, and they're less productive. So see if that's true for you as it is for many other people. The Alkaline Way Guide is a booklet, The Joy of Food, The Alkaline Way Guide. We make available physically. You can purchase these for reuse with your clients. They're also available electronically. And on page 14, you will find the Alkaline Way Guide and a food effects on acid-alkaline body chemical balance, a real mouthful. You can find this online. It's available both in color and in black and white at www.perque.com/food effects chart. That's one word. So it's www.perque.com/food effects chart, FOODEFFECTS CHART. And there you will find the food and chemical effects on acid-alkaline body chemical balance so that you can select more of the beneficial alkaline-forming foods and less of the acid-forming foods. We recommend that while you're recovering, 80% of the volume of what you eat, 80% of what you put on your plate, should be alkaline-forming and 20% acid-forming. Would now like to summarize the Alkaline Way to Sustainable Health. There are 10 components. We'll look at the first 4 on this slide. The first is to calibrate a score bait to identify antioxidant need. The second is to stay hydrated using the palm skin pinch relaxation test. The third is to have enough magnesium and other minerals to keep the first AM or morning urine in the healthier 6.5 to 7.5 range. And the fourth point is that we want pre and probiotics, prebiotic fibers, and probiotic organisms to replenish intestinal health. Here we would recommend the transit time, a subject of a different webinar, with a healthy transit time being 12 to 18 hours. And we'd want to increase the fiber and other constituents in our diet to achieve a healthier transit time of 12 to 18 hours rather than the typical American who ranges between 4 days, 96 hours, up to 144 or more hours. Sometimes people have stool coming out today from food they ate last week, and that's much too long. We would recommend that what you have for dinner tonight come out by breakfast tomorrow. The next components of the Alkaline Way to Sustainable Health are to eat in harmony with nature and lifestyle, eat in harmony with your personal nature and lifestyle, and eat as much as possible that's locally grown, vine ripened, organic or biodynamically sourced. If you have access to a CSA or a community supported agriculture link, we would recommend that. If you can have a kitchen garden, we recommend that. The sixth component is restorative sleep, making that a priority. We must sleep in balance with our activity. The next is to work our muscles and relax in some proportion. We do want to be intensely engaged, and we want to be equally intensely relaxed, if you will. I find relaxation to be as important as physical activity to keep my own balance. And the eighth component is to do our best and appreciate that we are doing our best. Each of us can do your or our best and appreciate ourselves for doing the best we can, not being perfect, but each day a little better, each day a little corrective that leads to a sustainable and substantial beneficial outcome.